just audio?
But it'll be audio when it gets fully released.
Got it.
Sir, welcome to the Tales of Leadership podcast. It's an absolute honor and a privilege to have you. Sir, can you hear me?
I can hear you, and it's a joy to be here with you, Josh. Thank you.
Yeah, no, perfect. We always have technical issues. This is what happens when you have an infantry officer trying to run his own technical podcast. But it is an absolute honor and a privilege to have you on, sir. And I'm looking forward to going through your leadership and your wisdom and the journey that you've been on and where you're continuing to serve today. So I'm excited to see where this goes.
Josh, me too. Thanks so much for taking the time to have me.
Yeah. So I think a great place to start, sir, is just providing an overview to the listeners of who you are.
So I think it starts with my family. I'm married to an amazing lady, Melanie. We've been married for 25 years. Actually, we took the oath of office as fellow ROTC cadets at 17 years old in Cambridge, Massachusetts together. Again, married for 25 years, 3 kids, including 2 in college, 1 who is a ROTC cadet at Baylor, and then 1 son still at home. And we serve together as a family. We always have, and we look forward to continuing to serve into the future together.
That's amazing. So I always love starting off with the definition of leadership. Everyone has their own unique one. And I've had General Petraeus on from the Army. I've had civilians, high entrepreneurs. Everyone has a different level and a different definition of leadership. How would you start to define leadership, and how has that changed really throughout the course of your career?
Josh, I've been a student of leadership certainly since I was a mid-level captain, and very deliberate about being a student, not just in what I read, but what I observe. One of the things that I encourage everybody that's a leader or budding leader to do is to keep a leadership journal. And I didn't start that until I was a lieutenant colonel, but I love the idea of recording the things that I see in myself or the things that I see around me so that I can be a deliberate observer and student of leadership. And I started doing that as a lieutenant colonel. Now I've got dozens and dozens of pages for each of my leadership assignments that I go back and review before I start any given leadership position. But really the biggest benefit is being intentional about observing the things that are around me. And the way I define leadership is bringing about a positive future that wouldn't otherwise occur without the leader in the position that he or she is in. And it's so important to realize that leaders have this massive impact, not just on the mission, but more importantly on people and the future of the growth of those individuals that can go on and do amazing things. And I love the opportunity to make an influence and an impact by being a leader. And I continue to keep that leadership journal and continue to be a student of leadership throughout the rest of my life.
I have been honored to film, I think, over 80 podcast episodes now, and no one has said having a leadership journal. So I am going to take that, and I'm going to continue that in my career. That's an amazing piece of advice, and I never would think about that. But being able to deliberately go back, be intentional with your own growth, and then capture lessons learned, that's a beautiful piece of advice.
So to me, it actually stemmed from when I was a squadron commander a year in, and a guy that was about ready to take over as a squadron commander elsewhere asked me what my recommendations were. And I had plenty, but I was a little bit worried that I had been losing opportunities to capture and remember those things that I wanted to do going forward and those things that I didn't want to do going forward. But ultimately, the idea that as you start journaling, you are far more intentional about observing the things that are going on around you, such that you are indeed a student of leadership, and that makes you better every day going forward.
And looking at the website that you have too, you have one of the beautiful definitions, like right up front, 3 words: inspirational, innovation, integrity filled leader. So I love each one of those. And I really want to hit first because I've never seen innovation within the definition of leadership. And if you could kind of walk through how innovation plays such a critical role, I think, in a leader's growth.
To me, it is a fundamental element of being a leader or being a good leader, because leaders aren't just there to mind the store and keep things simmering in the way they always have been.
Mm,
A leader is constantly looking to do a couple of things. Number one, to help the individuals that are within their sphere of influence to become the best possible version of themselves, but also to grow the organization in a way that makes it better over time. And if you are not
mm.
innovating, then you're just the manager that's minding the store instead of intentionally bringing about a future that wouldn't otherwise exist if you weren't there as the leader that your organization needs you to be.
I love that. You're just the manager if you're not an innovator, because leaders have to be able to provide a mission, provide a vision, but also take the team somewhere new. You're always growing and you're always moving forward. I love that advice. And I kind of want to start off with where your leadership journey really started. I know you got your bachelor's in science from MIT, which is awesome, by the way. What made you choose to serve your country and join the United States Air Force?
It started back in my hometown of Port Angeles, Washington, the very northwest
Mm,
tip of the country. My
yeah.
dad worked for the National Park Service. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, and I had this loving family, but also a family that emphasized the importance of citizenship,
Mm,
community, and patriotism. And then literally, I was sitting as an eighth grade boy in our one screen theater in Port Angeles watching Top Gun, and I decided that that's what I wanted to do with my life. And I looked around and saw who had the best planes. The Strike Eagle had just come out. And I said, all right, the Air
mm.
Force has the best planes. That's what I want to do with my life. And ultimately, that's the plane that I wanted to fly. And that's how I decided ultimately to jump into Air Force ROTC at MIT and then commission into the Air Force to serve ultimately for 33 years from the time I took that oath as a 17-year-old at the beginning of ROTC until I retired about a year ago.
Wow. It's funny, because when I joined the Army, I totally different, trajectory is like, I wanted to jump out of airplanes. It's like, where can I go that I knew was going to be guaranteed that I could go to airborne school and do all those crazy things that I wanted to do when I was younger. Now my body is regretting those decisions at an older age. But that is amazing that we get inspired by each one of the individual branches of service and what they're great at, what the strengths are, and that's why we always join. And what I'd like to kind of hit next is your education. So I was looking all the different masters that you have. I think you have what, 4 or 5 different master's degrees, and that's inspiring from the point of that you are continuing to grow. You're a lifelong learner. What drives you to push yourself, at least in that type of situation?
Let me start by saying that my wife is a chemistry PhD from Berkeley,
Wow.
and she constantly reminds me that no number of master's degrees will ever add up to a PhD. So she keeps me humble at home. She's actually a professor at the Naval Academy of Chemistry, an amazing
Mm,
lady. But frankly, all of us should have this desire to constantly grow. And while getting master's degrees are nice, there's an opportunity constantly, not just by journaling, but by reading or
yeah.
by listening to podcasts or by going to lectures, that we have an opportunity to constantly be growing. And if we're not, then the world is going to pass us by. And we need to be intentional, not just about doing well at the job we've been assigned, but finding ways to develop ourselves intentionally and deliberately now so we're ready for the next challenge in the environment that's around the corner.
I love that, sir. So transitioning in, you're starting off in your Air Force career. You're getting out of an academic leadership role, and I see this a lot. But that transition of now you actually have authority and responsibility. What were some of the biggest challenges that you faced going from an academic kind of schoolhouse into the Air Force?
Josh, I actually think that the Air Force does its future leaders a disservice by
Mm,
not giving pilots in particular an opportunity to lead early on. My first
yeah.
several assignments, I was there as a wingman and then a flight lead. And as a flight lead, you may lead individuals in a particular mission at a given time, but you don't have subordinates in the sense that leaders need subordinates to grow and develop. And it wasn't until I was a mid-level captain and a flight commander where I
Mm,
actually started to have some level of formal authority. And I actually think it does leaders of the future a disservice by not giving them at the earliest opportunity a chance to develop and learn lessons as a leader that you could learn as a lieutenant. And I believe that the Navy actually, for their flyers, gives their ensigns and young lieutenants an opportunity to lead a
Yeah.
small cadre of maintenance crews on a ship. And the Air Force does not do that. And so now you get to a flight commander position, or maybe even a lieutenant colonel squadron commander position, and you just haven't had the repetition, the reps of going through leadership situations and learning and growing as a result of that repetition. And I think that the Air Force does a disservice to the leaders of the future by not giving them that opportunity. But once I started to get the opportunity, Josh, I loved it. And I started to transition from a mindset of loving the flying part of my job to loving the opportunity to develop, mold, and help our individuals become the best possible version of themselves while you care for them and their family members. And I loved that. And it was around the squadron commander time where I really started to dedicate myself to a desire to spend the rest of my life developing the leaders that our nation needs.
Yeah, the Army, I think, does a phenomenal job about this, of being able to transition out of ROTC. I went to Marshall University. I transitioned out of ROTC. My first assignment was a platoon leader in Afghanistan for 44 soldiers. I had 4 strikers, 4 MAT-Vs, a whole bunch of other stuff. Here I was, a 23-year-old, just thrusted into a highly kinetic deployment and given so much responsibility. And I credit that specific situation and scenario for me for the growth that I've won today. And just like you, continuing to push myself and grow every day. But then I also learned in that time, I love serving other people and being a servant leader. And hearing your story, it sounds the same way.
It is. And I'll tell you that there are certain career fields in the Air Force that do that phenomenally.
Yeah.
Maintenance officers at a young age, or defenders, security force officers at a young age, get those opportunities to lead very quickly large organizations. And they have the privilege of growing up at a young age and getting to have that impact on people. And it takes a while for our air crew to get there, but it is so satisfying to, again, help people become the best possible version of themselves.
So growing through your ranks, started getting more authority in terms of leading, but what was the most challenging leadership role that you had in either of your commands from your perspective, and why was it the most challenging?
It actually was during my time as a squadron commander. I was the director of
Oh,
operations in my F-22 test squadron. And then
okay.
I fleeted up to 2 years as a squadron commander. But right at the end of my time as the director of operations, we had a plane crash that
Mm,
ultimately lost an F-22, but lost an amazing civilian test pilot named Dave Cooley. It happened on March 25th, 2009. And then I was already chosen to be the squadron commander that would take command of that organization about 4 months later. And I
wow.
remember that I took command. I had a new group commander, a young '06 that was my group commander. And he brought me in on day 11 on the job and said, "Dragon, that's my call sign. You're not the guy." And I said, "Sir, what do you mean by that?" And he said,
Mm,
"I don't think that you should be the commander of this squadron, that you're not the right guy. I wouldn't have chosen you." And I said, "Sir, you should fire me." And he said, "No,
wow.
I'm stuck with you." And I really was reeling as I went back to my squadron on day 11. And then I rested on it that night. I talked to my wife about it. I thought about it. I prayed about it. And then just to carry that burden for 2 years, believing that at any moment that I would get fired, um, and then ultimately not getting fired, getting promoted early out of the assignment, that was a blessing. But just to go through those turbulent times where I knew that at least his initial impression was such that I
Wow.
wasn't the right person to lead this organization out of that tragedy that we had experienced. It
Yeah.
was an extremely gut-wrenching time. And frankly, it actually helped me develop from a selfless leader perspective, because I believed that night when he told me that my career was essentially terminal. And at that
Mm.
moment, I believed that I didn't need to do anything to help my own career because it was done. And I could just be the type of leader that my organization needed me to be. And ultimately, that developed the habit patterns of selflessness that I credit carrying my leadership style through since that moment on to this point.
I wrote that down, lead like no one is watching. I love that, because it feels like you have there's no pressure on you when you get in a position like that. Worst case scenario, you don't progress. Obviously, you did, sir. You had a highly successful career in the United States Air Force. But what I've seen, leaders who have like that toxic mindset of where they set negative cultures within their organizations, they can produce negative leaders. But there's always those rare few, and you're one of them, sir, that has been able to switch their mindset, and instead of like, okay, if I have nothing to gain here, I'm going to go be the best possible leader that I can. And that has always been the glue that I've seen for phenomenal leadership, is just being authentic. And then coming in with the question of like, how can I add value to the team today versus the agenda? How can I get promoted to the next rank today? And that's always separated amazing leaders in my eyes, is just that one small change.
It is, Josh. It really is this opportunity that you can either focus in your position on
Yeah.
moving through the ranks, or you can focus on creating this legacy of impact on individuals and their families so
Yeah.
that they can go on and do great things in or out of the military. And you think about the latter and the type of impact and influence and ultimately joy that you can have in creating an environment where other people rise to go on and do great things in a variety of areas of their life. That is what true leadership is about.
Have you ever heard the term, sir, from John Maxwell? When I read this, it just stuck with me. It's success versus significance. And
I
from that,
have. Yeah,
yeah.
I have. There's actually a book that I recently reread, Halftime, and essentially it's talking about
Oh,
someone in my type of position where
yeah.
you're only about halfway through your productive career. I served for about 30 years in the military. I have about 30 more productive years to go. But the idea, the
It's
subtitle
amazing.
of that book is From Success to Significance. But I
Yeah.
actually don't like that type of subtitle or thinking for certainly people like you and I that served in the military, because we've hopefully been doing something that had not just success, but significance in the first
Yep.
half of our lives. And ultimately, we should use that to parlay additional significance into the second half of our lives.
Yeah. To me, 100%. So if you can discover what you're passionate about and what your purpose is of why we're put on this planet, because we're all designed by God for greatness and purpose. I truly believe that. And when we can connect those two, then we can start seeing significance in our life. And it's not about growth that we can achieve. Like some of the richest people in the world, some of the friends that I have, they have a lot of money, but they're not happy. They have success, but they do not have significance. And when we can add value to other people, when we can be the inspiration and the light for other people, it fills our cup up. And when our cup is full, we can overflow it and give it to other people.
You're spot on, Josh, with that. And I believe actually that tees up an interesting thought about leadership
Mm,
that applies to the human condition. Fundamentally, I believe that people desire two things in their lives. They want to be cared for or loved, that
mm,
servant type of leadership. And
yeah.
people want to be part of something that is greater than themselves. And now that takes servant leadership for the first part and communication of the right type that ties the specific mission of what you are doing in your organization to something that really matters, such that you can provide your subordinates that element of significance. And if you do both of those things as a leader, if you care for people and you communicate in a way that helps them understand their significance, then there is no limit to what you can do in your organization and what those individuals can go on and do with the rest of their lives.
Podcast could be over right there with that a piece of advice. That's amazing, sir. So you commanded some very large organizations. I think your largest command was the 11th Wing at Joint Base Andrews, over 17,000 personnel. That's incredible. Just that amount of authority and responsibility. When you get to that level of strategic leadership, how do you manage all the competing tasks that you have?
Josh, I believe that a leader only does a few things. They cast a
Mm,
bold vision, they set wide boundaries so that the individuals under their command can achieve that mission in the best way based on their expertise. They resource that vision, they break down barriers to achieve that vision, and then they get out of the way. And it's just like anything else where you've got to resist as a leader, especially as you move up the chain of command. You've got to resist the desire or the inclination to get too involved. Because once you do, then now you're taking the opportunity for initiative and creativity away from the members of your team. And you've got to be very deliberate about what are the things that you can uniquely do based on your position in that leadership role, and then delegate down the rest. Again, using that model of you've got a vision, you set the boundaries, you resource, you break down barriers, and you get out of the way. And it really is just an opportunity for you to think about how you can uniquely provide benefit or advantage for your organization. And then you create expectations for those under you to do those other things that you're not specifically uniquely qualified or advantaged by doing.
It creates a problem-solving organization. When you could do those things, have a bold vision with a mission statement, with a vision and a thread of how we're gonna get there with the left and right limits, and keep them wide. How I don't care how you get to the end state as long as it's ethically correct, morally correct, then we are on the right track. Because how you do something may be different than me, but if we still get to that desired end state, it's the same. And resourcing it, breaking down barriers, and getting out of the way. And it goes back to I think how you define leadership is inspirational innovation. So like those two things, when we can have innovation and creativity, the organization can grow exponentially. And it doesn't matter, I think, even in terms of culture or in terms of profit, if you're in a civilian organization, that is the key, I think, to a thriving organization, is building that culture of problem solving organization. Everyone is a thinker and a doer at the same time.
I'm a firm believer that the more the leader can unlock or
Mm,
unshackle the talent that exists amongst their people, the better that organization is going to be. I, as a wing commander at Andrews, am not going to be the expert, not even close, at all of the subsets of our mission. But if I
yeah.
can do the things that I'm uniquely qualified to do, and then get out of the way after breaking down barriers and resourcing the experts that are within those areas, then now I am creating a situation where their talent is unlocked. They are motivated. They have the opportunity to employ their creativity. And now, in almost every case, I am dazzled by the type of solutions they come up with
Mm,
that if I was prescriptive, I would have never considered.
yeah. So having those types of commands, and then also commanding in test wings. So I know from a standpoint operationally and in a controlled environment, one of the key things that we have to do as leaders is managing risks.
Yep.
How did you manage risks in a testing organization? And then how did you manage risk in an operational organization?
Essentially, Josh, it's the same thing, that there's three essential steps to proper risk management. The first
Mm,
step is to understand or survey the risk. The next step is to mitigate the risk in every way that is reasonable and possible. And then the last step is allowing the decision maker at the right level to accept the residual risk. But it starts with understanding, and then it moves on to that mitigation, and then you've got to make the decision based on your command climate as the leader, who's
yeah.
going to accept the residual risk. And if you're fairly diligent about doing those three steps, then now you are doing everything you can, whether in a test or an operational organization or whatever the mission may be, to make sure that you are buying down the risk to the appropriate level and then allowing the residual risk to be accepted at the right level.
Mm, I love that advice. So getting ready, 30 years in the United States Air Force is an absolute incredible feat. It really is. That is inspiring to me. I think I'm at 16 or 17 years in the Army right now. And to get to that point, one day at a time, I'm continuing to grow, but someone at 30 years in the military, that's inspiring, regardless of the rank that you were able to achieve, which you achieved one of the highest ones. But you transitioned out of the United States Air Force at a certain point, and you quickly, I think, transitioned and had a purpose and a plan. Could you walk me through that piece of you transitioning out of the Air Force? Were you lost at that time? Did you know what you wanted to do?
Josh, about 10 years ago, I started to have the inclination that maybe there was something that I could do that was more impactful to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And I
Mm,
never felt that it was time or the place was right to get out, but I started to have this urge that maybe there was something else out there. And as I developed through the ranks, I started to get more and more convicted that there was indeed something else, just based on the skill set and the experiences that I had, and my
yeah.
concern that to some extent our nation was headed in the wrong direction. And actually, about 2 years ago, I was dialed into the Air Force Thunderbird change of command, the demonstration team for the Air Force. And a guy was taking command, Astro Elliott, who I had been a mentor for about a decade. And when he was on stage giving his change of command speech, he pointed at some point to the huge American flag behind him on the stage. And he said this: if that starts to falter, you do not walk away. You engage with
Mm,
everything you've got and you fight to bring it back. And it was essentially that moment where I realized that I needed to engage with everything I've got to fight to bring it back in order to achieve, as a lifelong desire, the support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And so a year ago, I retired from the Air Force. I had a couple of things that I knew I wanted to do in the short term, but ultimately I knew that jumping in the political world was the
yeah.
right first step in this half of my life to support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Transitioning from a heavy leadership role into a heavy political role, have you had any challenges kind of managing that? And I know that leadership can overcome any type of political barrier, and your background will obviously stand that test of time. But have you run into any issues between politics and leadership?
I'm only 2 months into my campaign. Things are going
Yeah.
great. And by the way, I absolutely love it. Maybe the most surprising thing about what I'm doing now is how much I enjoy the same kind of things that I enjoyed when I was a wing commander or senior
Hmm.
defense official of our nation to Baghdad or running international affairs for the Air Force. I love communicating with people and conveying either information or
Oh,
inspiration or raising the level of the dialogue. And during this journey, and once I get elected and take my office on January 3rd, 2025, my motto or my mindset is that I'm providing leadership. I'm not there to provide politics. And
amen.
here's what I mean by that: that I see at least the current version of politics in the world today, and whether it's at the state level in most states or certainly in Washington, D.C., leadership and politics is diametrically opposed.
Mm,
Leadership is essentially about being selfless, and politics is about being selfish. Or
yes.
leadership is about opportunities for mutual benefit, while politics is this zero sum game where I win so that you lose, or if you win, I lose. Leadership is about raising the level of the dialogue, uniting and inspiring. And politics is about sowing seeds of fear, doubt, and division. They are diametrically opposed. Politics has gotten us into the mess that we're in as a nation, and they're not going to get us out. Leadership is going to get us out. And my intent as a campaigner, as a candidate, and then ultimately as a United States Senator is to bring leadership, not politics, to the realm, and ultimately use that to wrestle our nation back to where we belong.
So I love that. I think that that is your motto that you just expanded on. Leadership is not politics, and that is refreshing and beautiful to hear. I think from someone who has the aspirations to take on the fight of going into the political realm. That is something that I don't think I would ever do. I don't think I have the patience to do it. So Godspeed to you, good sir. But continuing on that theme, collaborative conservation. When I was going through, I guess LinkedIn stalking you to make sure that I was able to ask the right questions, I came across that term, and I've never really heard that before. Could you expand upon that?
Josh, first of all, thanks for stalking me. I appreciate it. I would
You're
encourage
welcome.
other people to stalk me on LinkedIn or at teichertformaryland.com, but be that as it may, I call myself a collaborative conservative. And here's what I mean by that: that I am conservative in my values, in my principles,
Mhm.
and my policies, but I'm also mission oriented. And that means that we've got real problems that require real solutions, and those real solutions require working with a variety of people. And so while I have these values and principles that I never intend to relinquish or to
Yeah.
compromise on. There is plenty of space of shared interests and values where the solution set to real problems lie. And I need to explore that space and encourage other people to do so alongside of me so we can solve the real pressing problems that we face as a nation.
Yeah. I think continuing on that too, what leadership traits, not just universally to you, but like within politics, I think are essential, especially now in the divisive time that we live in.
When I was the senior defense official in Baghdad, I was there deployed for 14 months from May of 2020 to July of 2021. It was a fairly violent time in Iraq. We were getting
Yeah.
rocketed regularly. It was during COVID. But I took that position about the same time as a new chief of defense, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the Iraqi military, took his position, a guy named General Abdul Amir Urala.
Mm.
And Urala was a guy that was known as extremely aligned with Iran. I'm convinced that he would have slit my throat if given an opportunity. But one of my
Mm.
roles was to meet with him weekly and try to find ways to have productive professional relationships that are
Wow.
beneficial to the Iraqi military, but to the United States. And before I started talking to Urala, and he was an intimidating figure, I game planned or role played with my team, and we came up with the intent or desire to focus on two things. Number one, to resonate or to relate as a human being. Everybody is a human being. Everyone has desires, goals, fears. They've got family, they've got friends, and there's ways to relate to them at the human level. And then we looked at his interests or Iraq's interests and our interests. And instead of lingering on the things that made us different or that didn't overlap in those Venn diagrams of interests, we
Yeah.
decided to focus very intentionally on the overlap. And if you think about what goes on in Washington, D.C., that we all are swearing an oath, even those up on the Hill and those staffers up on the Hill, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Yeah.
Back with Urala, we had massively productive professional meetings every single week.
Hmm.
If I could do that with Urala by
Yeah.
focusing on shared humanity and mutual interests, then how could we not do exactly the same thing alongside of Americans up on the Hill and elsewhere in Washington, D.C. by focusing on exactly the same thing?
I wonder if you could walk me through the culture that you are inspiring and wanting to change. So I think now more than ever, we need to learn how to give authority back to our parents, be able to stand up to our near peer threats that we have. And working within SOCOM now, I can confidently tell you that there are amazing men and women every single day that are doing amazing things for this country that I'm just honored and blessed to continue to serve. But what is your, I guess, pillars, if you would, and how we could begin to change our culture back to continue to inspire the world and bring hope?
Josh, one of the things that concerns me is that the biggest threat that America faces is not the pacing challenge of China. It's not Iran. It's not Russia. It's North Korea. It's our own dysfunction. And
Yeah.
instead of cultivating and exploring that big overlapped area where almost everybody on the Hill probably shares some level of objectives or interests,
Yeah.
we satisfy ourselves by yelling about the things that make us different. We need to get back to realizing that the world is a dangerous place, that we've
Yeah.
got real problems in education, in the economy, in public safety, in national security. And we need to be very intentional about exploring those areas where the solution set is rich with overlap instead of just being satisfied with yelling about what is different from one another from the opposite sides of the aisle.
Mm. I love that. I wrote that down, the overlap and then that connection to with working with the individual in Iraq. I, from a standpoint of at a tactical level, when I was embedded with an Afghan company in a platoon, we were during the middle of Ramadan, kinetic firefights almost every single day. We had an interpreter, but that single interpreter was the thread, cultural thread between us and them. And before the well was toxic. I'll just say that when I'm not going to throw a unit out there, but before we got there, that well was toxic. And I began to bridge that gap exactly how you did. I was intentional with the time. And when I went in, I found how we could relate to one another. And then I figured out that sweet spot. And I never thought about the overlapping interests, but I figured out how can I help you and how can you help me? And I guess to use a poor analogy, but Michael Scott from The Office, how can we do a win-win-win? But I absolutely love that. But transitioning now outside of your inspirations within politics, I know you just recently wrote a book called Boom: Leadership That Breaks Barriers, Challenges. I can't remember the title of it now.
Nope, it's Boom:
What's the title?
Leadership That Breaks Barriers, Challenges Convention, and Ignites Innovation.
Yeah. Would you mind just sharing to me and the listeners of what that book is about?
So it is a leadership and innovation book for any level of leader in any position in any realm. And it stems from my experiences when I gave up command at Joint Base Andrews in 2018. I had 8 days to drive my family across country and take command at Edwards Air Force Base there in the Mojave Desert, where we do our primary flight test for the Air Force. And when I showed up at Edwards, this was my third time there, I was appalled that this place that was responsible for cutting edge technology, the next generation of aerospace for our nation, was mired in the muck of bureaucracy. And we made it our number one priority to break down those barriers and change the culture fundamentally at that organization and spark a culture of innovation.
Hmm.
And if you read some of the purveyors of cultural change, like John Cotter, you may believe that cultural change takes 5 to 10 years. And I was not satisfied with that. And we
Yeah.
found some ways very intentionally and aggressively to essentially change the culture from one of a bureaucratic mess into the pace setter innovative organization in the United States Air Force. And we did so in about 6 months. And that innovation culture continues. In fact, we had more innovative activity amongst our base of about 11,000 people than the rest of the Air Force combined. And that book is a tale of that journey and about how to break down barriers of any sort and create innovation in any organization. And I think that it's an interesting story with tales about aerospace and Chuck Yeager, a little bit of stories about Joint Base Andrews and Iraq and MIT and some other places I had been. But I think it's an entertaining and chock-filled book with opportunities to learn and grow as a leader at any level.
I haven't got an opportunity to read that book yet,
Come
but
on, Josh, what's the deal?
It is
Read
on.
it.
I know it's on my list. I may or may not have already bought the book. I can't wait to dig into that. And you just said something that is absolutely critical. You cannot. It doesn't take 5 to 10 years to change
Nope.
the culture of an organization, and I think a lot of people outside of the military do not understand that fact. Because being in the military, I have only ever been in a leadership position between one year maybe to 14 months. As you progress, you have more time and a position, but in the Army, it's 1 year and I move, 1 year and I move. And that 1 year, you can go through the whole gambit of leadership, of restructuring the culture within your organization, setting a climate that is productive and fosters problem solving. You can do all of that, but it takes intentionality. And I love it from your standpoint of such a strategic level of leadership through all the wisdom and lessons that you've learned in your background, especially academic background of innovation and STEM, marrying that with leadership. And I'm excited to read the book from that standpoint, because that's going to be absolutely amazing nuggets of wisdom. And how could you share one thing from the book that you would be willing to share?
No, so let me give you a couple. And the first one is
Okay.
essentially what our definition of innovation was, or how we were going to unlock and unleash our team. And we created a cycle that we call the listen, consider, act cycle. And essentially, it goes back to that idea that leaders don't do much other than bold vision, wide parameters, break down barriers, resource, and get out of the way.
Yeah.
But if we have a team of 11,000 people, then the best way to allow your organization to turbocharge is to start creating a culture where any member of the team believes that if they've got an idea, someone is listening, someone will consider it, and someone will act appropriately. It doesn't mean we're going to get to yes, but it means that somebody truly is going to listen, consider, and then act appropriately. We had something that we called the Summer of Waivers, where there are a ton of things that get in the way of individuals down the trenches that are doing the job. And we said throughout this summertime, if you've got a waiver because a rule is getting in your way, then submit it. Nobody between you and me as the wing commander can say no. They can recommend no, but they can't say no. And ultimately that waiver has to get up to me very quickly. And in about a month or two, we had waived over 100 things that were getting in people's way. Interestingly enough, I tell a tale about Chuck Yeager. He was in the middle of test pilot school when he was called out to fly the X-1 and ultimately to break the sound barrier. And he breaks the sound barrier. And then some bureaucrat said, hey, wait a second, Chuck Yeager, you haven't graduated from test pilot school. You can't be a test pilot. And so he went back to test pilot school, and literally they almost washed him out until someone said, hey, this is stupid. We've got to waive this. He already has done test more than anyone else ever had on the planet, and they waived it. But just think about the types of stupidity that exist in a bureaucracy where just because a rule was written in one set of conditions, it's applied to every set of conditions, even though it doesn't make any sense. And ultimately, it's getting in the way of your people and their well-being and their ability to achieve the mission. And we as leaders, one of the things we can do is find a way to break down those barriers. And the Summer of Waivers was a fun way that we did that.
So Chuck Yeager is an alum from West Virginia. So born and raised in West Virginia, the Yeager Airport in Charleston, West Virginia. So that's near and dear and close to my heart. That's awesome. So
yeah, I still keep in touch with his widow, Victoria. She's a wonderful friend. In fact, I was on a speaking engagement with her this summer there in West Virginia, and she showed me some of the stomping grounds of Chuck.
What parts of West Virginia were you at?
So we based out of Charleston, but then we did some driving down, and I can't remember the name of the college, but we spoke to some junior ROTC cadets about an hour and a half to the south. And then we spent some time there in Charleston proper with some friends of hers. And it was just a great time to hear some of those tales from General Yeager and to befriend Victoria, who she and I and Chuck had spent some time together alongside of my wife at the 75th anniversary of test pilot school back in 2019.
That's awesome. All right. So now starting thinking long-term, you get into the Senate, all right, you start crushing it within politics. 5 to 10 years from now, where do you want to be? What type of change do you want to continue to bring inspiration and growth just personally for you? Where do you see yourself in 5 to 10 years when your leadership journey?
Josh, my lifelong mission statement is to maximize my impact on people in our nation. And I've got 30 productive years to do that in this realm of elected or appointed federal public service. I don't exactly know how it all is going to transpire, but I go back to that oath of support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and that's a lifelong mission for me. And we're going to see how this election cycle goes, and then we're going to see how I can continue to maximize my impact on people in our nation. I'll tell you, one of the things that I learned to love, both as a SAS student, when I wrote a thesis on building partner capacity, and then my experience as the SDO dad in Baghdad, and then running international affairs for the Air Force, is that I love whole of government national security strategy and policy. And so the opportunity down the road to continue to use that interest, and I believe that unique skill set I have to maximize impact on people in our nation, is something that I intend to pursue.
So one of the last questions I want to ask you, sir, is someone who's getting ready to follow in your footsteps. Maybe that cadet who's listening to this, that is at a university. I said Marshall University because that's where I went. Getting ready to start their leadership journey, start their career. What advice would you give them?
That's an awesome question. I'll tell you, Marshall, by the way, I was inspired by watching We Are Marshall recently. And I think it's Brad Smith, who's the current president. I actually got to meet him with Victoria when I was out there a few months ago. He's a West Virginia boy that left and did amazing things in the corporate world, and then had this passion to come back and serve in his alma mater and the community that he left. Now, he's a great man. If you get a chance to spend some time with him, you will be inspired. And frankly, that tees up the answer to that question, which is find something that you believe can give your life higher purpose and meaning. And there's a variety of ways that you can do that. I've chosen to do that in a variety of ways through service in the military. I happen to preach, and I enjoy the opportunity to do some of that around the world as well, and to
That's
serve my
awesome.
Lord. But find something that you enjoy, that you have a skill set commensurate with, and something that allows you to fulfill your higher purpose. And those elements are the elements that give life the joy and the purpose and the meaning and the fulfillment that you will have if ultimately you weave those things together.
So the last part of this podcast, or I do the final show segment, I call it the killer bees. So the same 4 questions that I ask everyone. So be brief, be brilliant, be present, and then be gone. If you're ready, we'll jump into it.
All right. I've never heard this before, but bring it.
Let's go. So what do you believe separates a good leader from an extraordinary leader?
Genuine care and concern for people and their families.
Number 2, what is one resource that you can recommend to our listeners?
Never stop growing, learning, and reading to develop yourself to be ready for the next challenge of your life.
Yeah. Question 3, if you could go back in time and give your younger self a piece of advice, what would it be?
When I was young, I was too focused on the immediate mission and not as focused as I should have been on learning the greater context of the world around me.
I love it. All right, last one, sir. How can our listeners find you, and how can they add value to you?
I so appreciate that. Track me down on LinkedIn, buy Boom the book, track me down on teichertformaryland.com. And specifically for my campaign, I ask people to do 4 things. Number 1, pray for me. Number 2, follow along. Number 3, share with your network if you like what you see. And number 4, donate as you see fit.
Sir, this has been an absolutely amazing podcast. Genuinely, I have learned a ton. I've taken over 6 pages of notes. So I'm looking forward to adding this to my leadership journal that I am now going to start, inspired by you. Again, sir, absolutely honored and privileged to be able to talk to you about something I'm deeply passionate about. And happy holidays. And tomorrow at the Reef Laying, where you will be, I will continue to pray about, taking my family there and just being grateful for the opportunity to serve and continue to be a leader.
Josh, your interview was awesome. And it truly is the case for those that serve. We stand on the shoulders of giants. And I look forward to recognizing some of those giants at Wreath Across America tomorrow at Crownsville Veterans Cemetery.
Yeah. Sir, have a great night. And thank you again.
You too, Josh. Thanks.